In the next 30 minutes, I am going to prove to you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that your life is in danger. And there's an old saying, you can't fix stupid. Well, I disagree. You can fix stupid through education. What you can't fix is when somebody pretends to be stupid. Enter into the mystery, the big mystery, where extremely powerful cosmic rays are coming from. We don't know where they come from. And we do pick up X-ray bursts of the photon energy, which is like a light wave. And they found that many ultra-powerful cosmic rays can originate from these areas in the sky that exhibit powerful photon bursts, and then years later the particles show up. So particles, high energy particles, and high energy photons can go hand in hand. But don't let that throw you off the trail, because the amount of cosmic rays that are being detected far exceeds any kind of calculation that can explain the abundance. Because these ultra powerful bursts that are picked up, the photon bursts, they're picked up in a scattered region of the sky, usually coming out of star clusters. So sporadic, non-uniform X-ray bursts happening in the sky like supernovas are rare, they're not uniform, and therefore cannot explain a consistent presence of extremely powerful cosmic rays. We know they don't come or originate from the sun. And so there's very few explanations and very few hypotheses that can explain the existence of these extremely powerful cosmic rays. We're talking the production of neutrinos, which is very difficult to produce. Neutrinos are so rare. They can go a whole year and only get one neutrino in a neutrino detector. So when we start getting more than that, they start coming in a more regular type fashion, you cannot blame that on star clusters millions of light years away. And since the sun is not capable of producing this amount of high energy particles, we have to assume very few hypotheses on their origins. The problem we are seeing is when people, and trust me, scientists know why and how these particles are originating. NASA knows. But you know how they segment and separate and compartmentalize the research so that very few people get to put it all together. You know, you work on one piece of the puzzle, somebody else works on the other piece of the puzzle, and then NASA gets to put the pieces together and don't share what the whole puzzle is showing. But what happens is that you have to look at the individual pieces, and that's what I'm going to do today. Scientists know where these high energy neutrinos are coming from. If they're flying out of the South Pole, that means they're entering in through the North Pole. So we look at all the research, very technical, very hard to read research on these origins of high energy particles, and the first flaw that we come across is they're using protons as a model. And so when you use protons as a model, then you're not getting the amount of energy that is needed to produce these high energy subatomic particles. But NASA's own admission that cosmic rays intensities have increased 19% beyond anything they've seen in the last 50 years. That's out of Caltech. And by the way, Caltech has a few dead astronomers, by the way. And they don't, they don't associate interstellar wind with the high energy cosmic rays. Why wouldn't you associate interstellar wind? Why can't that be the source of your high energy neutrinos and muons and all these subatomic cascades of particles? Well, there's people who've connected those dots, but they won't allow, NASA won't allow it all to be put together for you. So then we look at the actual experiments done on helium. And when they were measuring the abundance of helium in the corona of the sun and around the sun, they found a distinctive change in this last solar cycle. What in a single cycle? What could change the sun? What can do that? Many of you will say God. God can do it. And remember, the Bible says something about the angel pouring out dust onto the sun, and the sun burns mankind. And so hit pause and read some of this. But what they were talking about in this article alone is very, very telling. They're not talking about neutral helium. They're talking about the appearance of alpha particles. Alpha particles are highly radioactive, highly energetic helium that has lost all of its electrons. And helium only has 2 electrons. This article talks about a distinctive change over the last 3 cycles in what the frequency and abundance of these alpha particles being picked up in the intermediate and slow solar winds. Now, wait a minute. How can you have a high energy particle in a slow wind? That's kind of like an oxymoron, because high energy particles generally travel faster and are hotter. Hotter particles travel faster. So what they're not telling you is you're not just measuring the sun's wind. And this article tells you that they are. They're forgetting to add the other piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle being the interstellar medium, which is not interstellar, it's interplanetary. It's being created within our own solar system. So they're talking about the abundance of alpha particles increasing over the last 3 cycles. So what would do this? And so we already know when you study the pickup ions, which is ions coming off the sun that were picked up by the sun and slungshot past. And so they're not talking. So now this article takes a fact, it takes real evidence and spins it. And this is how they've really tried to hide all of the things that are happening on the sun, by calling it an altered magnetic field configuration, affecting the way helium got processed and depleted in the solar atmosphere. So, but it says right there in the middle, the frequency of the alpha helium is significantly higher in slow intermediate solar winds. Well, why would what causes the solar wind to be slow and intermediate? Oh, the interference of a second wind. Whenever do you get intersecting currents in water and it doesn't spin and slow down and redirect the currents? The only way that you would even see it in fast solar wind is when you're downstream in the helium focusing cone. Which leads to this next article, talking about the helium focusing cone. They're talking about pickup ions, which are ions that don't come from the sun, but are focused by the sun. The sun picks them up. They talk about the ibex measurements now provide a strong indication for the presence of a secondary neutral helium that is thought to originate in the outer heliosheath from charge exchange. Well, that's a fancy explanation, but the real simple explanation is that there's a brown dwarf fragment out there spewing neutral helium everywhere, every direction, constantly in the solar system. Think of a sprinkler that goes in a circle and sprays. Well, this one's spraying not only out of the North Pole, South Pole, but also spraying at the equator too. So water is coming out in all 4 dimensions. And so this talks about how the helium velocity distribution functions throughout the heliosphere are characterized in this study. And the inner heliosphere, they exhibit an intricate structure, in particular downwind of the sun. Now, the sun doesn't have one direction. The sun is a spiral wind. So how can you have a downwind from the sun? How do you do that? Because they're talking about the second wind. It originates from one side of the solar system, speeds up as it gets near the sun, and is ejected out into the other side of the solar system, which is the downwind. And right there they call it the helium focusing cone, where it resides as well. What a coincidence. Didn't see that coming, that they were picking up all these different chemicals, these different ions that are concentrated, and they don't come from the sun. So this increase in particles, because NASA keeps it secret, is responsible for 40 SpaceX satellites to fall out of orbit. This is a story that did not get much publicity. It's funny how they don't want you to see something, you won't see it. But 49 Starlink satellites in low Earth orbit last week were planned on being accelerated around the Earth and then boosted into a higher orbit. And 40 out of 49 satellites fell out of their intended orbits. They fell from the 40. There is a God, huh? And of course, now they've got to confuse you, and they have to kind of make explanations why they didn't calculate this. Well, they said, well, we had a geomagnetic storm. We have geomagnetic storms all the time, and this wasn't even a big geomagnetic storm. It was a small geomagnetic storm, but nonetheless, It just happened at the wrong time. It was just a timing thing. We had a geomagnetic storm, and you know what? It created drag. It was like a boat trying to go upstream and losing its speed, slowly but surely losing its speed. And as it lost speed, the drag became even more influential, and they all of a sudden they could not escape Earth's gravity, and down they came. Up to 40 satellites were re-entering or already had re-entered the atmosphere when this statement was released. They said, I quote, "Those particles made it harder for the satellites, which were planned to provide internet access, to maintain their orbits." Now, come on, guys. Why would you launch 1,800, 1,000, 100 even satellites? I mean, that's prohibitively expensive. Why would you embark on that kind of endeavor just to provide internet access? I don't think so. Well, yeah, we're just going to launch hundreds and hundreds of satellites just so we could give you internet. Can you imagine how expensive that internet must be to pay for all of those satellites? But when you are a scientist and you are a rocket engineer and a planetary physicist, and you're trying to calculate escape speed, the problem is if NASA is hiding the density of these helium particles, then you cannot calibrate efficiently and effectively the escape velocity because of drag. If you're just calculating what comes from the sun, you're missing half the equation. So the origins of all these cosmic rays is a single cause. You can't increase the density by 20% in just a few years by just having all of a sudden a bunch of gamma ray bursts from star clusters, billions of light years away, millions of light years away, hundreds of thousands of light years away, and what they just all of a sudden are just started to emit these bursts. And the thing is the further away you are from a gamma ray burst, the more scattered the particles become. So the fact that these things are out in star clusters that are hundreds of thousands of light years away would mean that when they get here, that you wouldn't get 10 particles per cubic centimeter, which is what they're measuring just as background particle concentration. So if there was a brown dwarf that was coming through our solar system and has come through our solar system, we maintain that it's come through our solar system, passed by Earth in 2019. What happened in December of 2019 when we said it was going to pass by us, the exact week we said it was going to pass by us? What happened that week? Oh, the largest single shift of our magnetosphere ever measured. Coincidence? I think not. So, but then there has to be other particles being brought into the solar system, and big particles like asteroids and comets, and the cometary presence is overwhelming. The cometary databases are shutting down because they just can't keep up. And remember, we've had now three, they can't agree on the number of interstellar visitors. These are like asteroids or asteroid comet like things that have come into our solar system and raced by the sun, but yet they're not part of our solar system. They came from another galaxy. Well, galaxies have trillions of stars, billions of stars, and yet one of these objects escapes all those stars' gravity and all the planets' gravity and becomes focused by our sun, our medium-sized star, and races by our sun, sometimes within the realm of 4 AU, 3 AU from the sun. And they're interstellar, I mean, coming from millions of light years away, hundreds of thousands of light years away. And guess what? They all showed up in like a 5-year span. What kind of coincidence is that? Where an object from millions of light years, hundreds of thousands of light years away, an object comes racing through by the sun, and not just one, not just two, but 3 and maybe even 4. And now they're talking about an 80-mile wide comet that is expected to come into the solar system in 2031. It's only going to pass as close as Saturn, the closest pass, as it orbits through our solar system. And this is so amazing, because in all of this commentary and impact and asteroid phenomenons that are just overwhelming databases, NASA now has to alter its original theory on how Earth was created. Now remember, we've never wavered. We've said Earth was not created by an accretion disk where a bunch of dust just decided to get together and then a bunch of comets just decided to target Earth with water. No, 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 no. We said our origin was a collision-based origin, and now NASA is slowly shifting that narrative. And this article kind of shows you this. This won't be the first time they say this object has made a trip through our solar system. Since most comets observed originated from the collision of space rocks that created Earth long ago. There it is, right there, in front of your eyes. A collision created Earth long ago. Now, notice they didn't have a big press conference. But here they are, slowly and meticulously changing the narrative of Earth's origin to accommodate the binary twin hypothesis. The sun has a binary twin. And there may be a third one out there. We may be part of a tertiary system. But right now, we're sold on the binary system. This megacomet is following a 3 million year long elliptical orbit. So it's been a minute since we've seen it last. So a 3 million year long elliptical orbit. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know how you could calculate a 3 million year orbit. That you would think would put it out way beyond the Oort cloud, where the sun's gravity shouldn't even impact it. But it does scream at you that these long period comets are related to a mega collision. And some of the debris, the hybrid debris in the inclined orbits, are maintaining semblances and influences of the original object that collided. And it takes two objects to collide. But the ones that are more cometary are maintaining the majority of the star-like qualities from the brown dwarf, and including material, including, what's the composition, but also the orbits themselves, because an object in motion wants to stay in motion and it wants to stay in that path. And so what we have is a big icy rocky planet, like we've been maintaining for the last 10 years, collides with an inclined star, and all the debris is varying hybrids of those compositions. And we have asteroids that are more rock-like, and we have comets that are a little more star-like, with volatile gases. In fact, we have had asteroids this past 5 years that have started off gassing. They were asteroids, but now they're acting like comets. So the notion of hybrid debris is very, very relevant when talking about comets. This comet, 80 miles in diameter, is one of the largest comets ever experienced. And we have really great high detailed pictures of many of these comets. None of them, not one of them, look like an icy snowball. Especially when they get within the realm of Mars. They really start to heat up. And so these things will maintain some of the materials that were combined with a collision. You collide a star with a planet, and if that planet is an icy planet, you're going to get lots of water. And you could have a molten core. And as you look at most of these comets, the nucleus always seemed to mimic lava rock, high temperature rock. So how do you get high temperature lava looking rock on something that's a dirty snowball? So, but these comets have overwhelmed us. They've overwhelmed the databases. Thousands and thousands of brand new comets, right along with what? Thousands and thousands of what? New asteroids, fireballs. In fact, I went to American Meteor Society. We looked up at the incidences of fireballs that break the sound barrier, because those are the ones that are most threatening. And we see a pattern. We see that there are many repeats of fireballs breaking the sound barrier that are occurring over the same regions of the Earth. Over the English Channel, over the Great Lakes, down the eastern seaboard, and then down the western seaboard. Again, many of them traveling in a southern trajectory. So that means they're coming in from the north. And if they're bolides, they're probably magnetic, and they're being focused by the magnetic field lines, which is why many of the significant impact craters on planet Earth align vertically. That is no coincidence. So as we go and start putting the pieces of all this puzzle together, we see not only are the comets mushrooming the numbers, but 764 bolide incidences where the sound barrier was broken and a sonic boom created by a space rock. Now, back in 2007, 2008, the number of rocks breaking the sound barrier were less than 10. Now there's 764. Around 2015 and 2016, those numbers plateaued. Until what happened? Until this brown dwarf passed Earth. And after 2019, that plateau of 500, between 500 and 600, breaking the sound barrier, these bolides, started to go up again. And we told you they would. And then they did. 764 in 2021, mimicking 2020. So then, if a brown dwarf is really creating all this radiation and creating all the heat, creating massive earthquakes, creating incredible volcanism, eventually the animals are going to suffer. And so we go around and we look to see if the animals are suffering. And yes, they are. It's in your face. As early as 2011, mass animal die-offs have been getting reported. And I mean, this one is talking about, and this is just written in 2015, about 700 million tons of animals. Enough to fill 1,900 Empire State Buildings worth of animals. And they're talking about fish and birds. They're saying, well, not yet the mammals. But then right after this, the mammals started to go. Just look up. Bighorn sheep die off. Moose die off. Seals die off. The mammals started to die off too. First we killed off the food supply, which are insects and smaller animals and vegetation. And then we started polluting the waters with high temperatures, creating algae blooms and bacterial blooms that when the animals drank from, the entire herd would die within 48 hours. Well, the mammals started dying off. Look up reindeer deaths, caribou deaths. And so as the years went on, we started chronicling more and more. Again, this from 2015, analysis of 727 mass die-offs. Nearly 2,500 animal species in the past 70 years. We found that such events are increasing among birds, fish, and marine invertebrates. Again, individuals killed, the number of deaths were decreasing for reptiles and amphibians, and they said was unchanged for mammals. Well, what survives these extinctions, these major extinctions? Animals that live underground. Cold-blooded animals that can hibernate through ice ages. Animals that can escape radiation by burrowing. Can you imagine? So, the pieces of the puzzle are coming together. It's coming together. But if there was, come on, higher truth. If there was another object in the solar system, the tides would be going crazy. Well, what do you think is causing all the new supermoons? There's been an extra gravitational influence. There's been a wobble to the Earth. NASA has finally reported on it. Remember, we were crazy. We were smoking weed for reporting a wobble in Earth. And now NASA must be smoking the same weed we are because they admitted to it. But they said it was due to melting ice. Creates a wobble. The melting ice is at top of the globe. So when you take mass off the top of a spinning top and you redistribute it towards the equator, the wobble should lessen. That's just basic physics. But no, NASA says melting ice is causing the wobble. But the flooding from high tides has doubled in just 30 years. Again, remember, whenever they're lying, you're going to see contradictions. But this guy here towing the boat, that's ocean water, by the way. That's the tide. That's not freshwater flooding. That's saltwater flooding. They call it sea level rise. But if this kind of flooding was due to an inch increase in sea level, which I highly doubt, then it would be every high tide. So obviously the tide and sea level change is not going to create 4 feet of water where there used to be dry land. What's going to do that is the supermoons and the extra gravitational influence. And so remember, that article talked about in the last 20 years there's been a 50% increase in high tide flooding. Well, then here's an article that talks about in 10 years there's a 60% higher incidences of flooding across the U.S. coastlines. And trust me, it's not the U.S. coastline, it's every coastline. If you have a high tide supermoon flooding in the East Coast, it's going to be on the West Coast too. And it's going to be in Australia too. And it's going to be in New Zealand too. Anywhere where there's a beach, there's going to be high tide flooding. Because you can't affect one part of the ocean without affecting the other part. So, but this one says increased flooding by 60% higher in just 10 years, where the article I just showed you said 50% higher in 20 years. So, I mean, that's a huge difference. And now they say it's 100% higher than 30 years ago. So, I mean, here comes the contradictions again, right? And they say this is due to long-term sea level rise trends. And then, of course, El Nino gets blamed for everything, right? But, so, El Nino conditions, El Nino is El Nino. It comes every few years. So what's different about El Nino that your tides are 100% higher than they were 30 years ago? Are we having more El Ninos? No. We're not. But we're having stronger El Ninos combined with extra gravitational influences. Then we have this high tide flooding, more dramatic. And then what makes it even worse is the number of tropical storms, which have doubled and tripled it. I mean, that one year we showed you, dozens and dozens. They had so many tropical storms, they had to start the alphabet over again. They had to go back to A when they named these tropical storms. So what's going on is very consistent with what we've been claiming all along, that a brown dwarf has come through our solar system and has changed every aspect of the solar system, including the radiation coming from the sky. But everything that you could predict should happen from a physics standpoint has been measured and confirmed as happening. Period. End of story. So, when the tide comes in and we see being blamed on sea level rise, scientists are laughing their heads off. Now the increase in storms will increase your flooding, yes, but associated with just high tides alone, high tide flooding, king tide flooding, we did not used to have king tide flooding. We did not have spring tide flooding. That never used to happen. You never used to go to a wharf where you could, walk along the seawall and eat of seafood and have to wade through the ocean to get there. Now you do, and it happens during supermoons, but also during extremely stormy seasons. And now people are saying, well, we had a long winter and we had a long spring. And at people that I've been preaching this and showing them the evidence, okay? And a definition of personality disorder and a definition of psychosis, one of the definitions is the inability to change your thinking when presented with facts. A complete inability. And so I've been showing people these facts. In fact, just last month, one of my best friends, I showed them the 197 degree dashboard temperature of a car in February, where the air temperature was 79 degrees. We are headed for trouble. But no, because we had a long winter. Well, we had these Arctic vortexes keep coming through, bringing in cold weather, pulsing. That has nothing to do with the solar radiation and the heat coming from the sun. And here they're going to tell you, they're giving you the predictive programming. 2022 will be amongst the warmest years ever. Extreme heat events. They're telling you it's going to happen. But no, because we had a lot of cold weather this winter. It means, well, let's look at Australia. Let's look at Australia, what's happening now, because they're coming out of their summer, and summer's coming to the north now. And they're talking about the marine heat waves still persisting, and they're just going to get worse. they are saying. Record-breaking Western Australia heat waves has days before it runs its course. Perth reaches 40 degrees centigrade for the 4th consecutive day and the 9th time this summer. Just breaking heat records. So if that's happening in Australia currently, what's going to happen when summer gets to the north? What, is something going to change? Well, you tell me what changes are going to happen to keep this from happening to us in the northern hemisphere. Please explain to me. Is it because of the winter? Oh, because we actually had a spring? You know, spring and fall have been kind of like blurry last 10 years. It seemed like we would get fall for 2 weeks, and then all of a sudden the heat was here. And it seemed like the summer would just drag on, and then fall would come for a couple weeks, and then winter was here. But no, we actually had a spring. That means our summer's going to be mild. Well, you explain to me the physics, please. Because I've explained the physics to you as Arctic vortexes. Here's another one. Australia ties its hottest temperature in record. It's a record hottest temperature ever in Australia. When did that happen? January 16th, 2022. So you can bet in the northern hemisphere this summer we're going to tie the hottest temperatures ever recorded in the northern hemisphere, and it's going to happen in Europe, it's going to happen in Siberia, it's going to happen in Canada, it's going to happen in the USA. Why? Because it happened in Australia. And what's causing the heat? We've showed you over and over again. The radiation charts are going through the ceiling. How can you have an increase in high energy cosmic rays and not increase the energy? And finally, what does heating the land do? Well, what happens is, especially in Siberia, if you were to clear a road, what happens then, the methane escapes and causes localized warming. The ice melts and water flows to the center of your little road that you cut, and you create a sinkhole that's derived through the warming permafrost, but initially created by a dirt road carved through the forest, where now that there's no shade on the ground, and then the permafrost melts, and the water sinks, and it causes erosion, and then the erosion releases methane, and the methane then causes more heat to build up, and we see this growing and growing and growing methane sinkhole. Without mankind, with just the warming permafrost, we're seeing pockets of methane creating thousands and thousands of these mounds. These mounds are methane bubbles. They are occurring in thousands. And we have methane lakes, which are the sinkholes where the water flows to the bottom, gets down actually to the old methane, works its way down, creates plumes, and touches deep methane pockets that are millions of years old and have nothing to do with the permafrost. This has, when you hit a methane bubble, when you're drilling deep in the Gulf of Mexico for oil and you're down, 900 feet below the crust, and all of a sudden you hit a methane pocket, that's ancient methane. So these water methane lakes are occurring, and right next to them there are methane bubbles from the permafrost. So the mounds are permafrost methane, and the lakes are a mixture of the permafrost with deep underground ancient methane. So we've tapped into a methane source we have not previously even calculated into our models of global warming. And you'll get people that will argue whether the warming climate is due to carbon dioxide emissions or not. You will get arguments on that. But there is unanimous consensus amongst every single scientist that if we ever enter into a methane runaway, we are entering into a extinction level event. There is not a climate scientist on the world that you can say runaway methane and they will say, oh, no problem. That will not happen. They may argue what the origin is, but they're not going to argue what the results are going to be. So we have methane lakes next to methane bubbles. Thousands of them, thousands of them. And some of these have already popped. X-ray images of the Arctic Ocean. Arctic Ocean is a rather shallow ocean, 300 feet deep. And we see lines of pockets of methane plumes have already popped. And this was taken, what, 5-6 years ago? So how many more do you think there are? And again, what's heating the ground is radiation from the sky. We had a significant, between March 13th and 14th, we had a significant, highly significant geomagnetic storm on a C flare. Okay, normally X flares and M flares will do this, but we was a glancing blow. So what would cause this was the fact that we were mixing particles that were heated by the sun but did not come from the sun. The pickup ions were mixing with the solar ions and exerting extreme pressure upon our magnetosphere, creating a GP index or KP index, which is a measure of the strength of a geomagnetic storm that was higher than we thought it was ever going to be. So we're finding more and more methane. The Arctic is melting. People, the Inuits, would get a beluga whale and they would create their own cellars. They would dig holes into the permafrost, and the permafrost itself was like a giant freezer. And now they cannot do that. You could walk into these underground cellars and smell the methane. And the belugas were thawing out and needed to be cut up and put into artificial freezers. That's happening now. What's also happening now is homes that were built on stilts, to accommodate high levels of snow and to accommodate flooding. Those are sinking into the ground because the permafrost is melting. So methane, and hit pause anytime you want to read some of this, but they're talking about just on the East Coast, just on the Atlantic. We never knew there was a whole lot of methane on the Atlantic coast, but they, 1,400 feet below the sea, they found 570 vents between the Georgia's or Bank, Massachusetts, and Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. So between North Carolina and Massachusetts, they found 570 vents. So, that's just a fraction of the vents that are there. And they had no idea these even existed. So the methane runaway is the death of Earth. It is the death of Earth. And if it's the death of Earth, it's more likely going to be the death of mankind. Unless, of course, you migrate towards the poles or you live in an underground bunker. And then there's the northwest coast. This is the Washington coast, near Vancouver Island. These are the number of methane seeps that were recorded in just over a year and a half, 2 years of oceanic exploration. The problem with this image of the Washington coast is that the California coast looks identical. Hundreds and hundreds of methane plumes. And finally, if what I am telling you was the truth, you know that there would have to be censorship all across the board. And to me, the biggest proof of truth is when mainstream tries to censor something and tries to keep you from reading it. Freedom of speech was all about hearing alternative theories. It was about checks and balances. And we need extremists to balance out other extremists. We need people who are like overboard pro-ecology to balance out the people that are overboard drilling in sanctuaries for oil, exploration. So we need extremists on one side to balance out the extremists on the other side, because we know there's very few people in the middle. Because why? Well, because media is designed to polarize people. But this is a page off the Integrative Space Weather Analysis platform. This used to have about 120 different magnetosphere and ionosphere instruments that measured the temperature of electrons, the concentration, the location of electrons, the ratio of electrons to protons. They even had some helium measurements there. Those were the first to go bye-bye. So in the realm of ionosphere, I clicked on ionosphere instruments. You used to get 5 or 6 pages with 6 instruments on each page. There used to be 30 or 40 instruments minimum that you can go and look at every single aspect of your ionosphere to try to track what was going on. And you could go back like 10, 15 years and compare so that you could see the changes. Currently today, there are only 6 instruments on one page. See that number 1 at the bottom? That's the only page on the ionosphere data now. So you get a IMPC total electron count map, which I'm sure the units have changed to kind of hide the increase in electrons. You get the polar cap potential, which, how do you use that to determine total electron concentrations and the temperature of electrons? Because really, the temperature of electrons will tell you where they're coming from. The POES hemispheric power, really, the CTIP. And some of these, you can go on, and even though they're there, you can look at the date, and they haven't been updated for 3 or 4 months. So just the fact that these 6 instruments are showing up on page 1 doesn't mean that they're being updated. But the instruments are still there. You can click on them. But some of these will not have updated information. So what is going on that you would remove dozens and dozens and dozens of measurements of particles in your upper atmosphere? Why would they just go bye-bye? Because the satellites that measure this are still up there. The satellites that beam this down to an automated system, those automated systems are still there. So what was the need to take down all these instruments? It wasn't money, and it wasn't manpower. It was censorship. But ultimately what happens, the heat is the number 1 destroyer of Earth. The Bible talks about, and other religious texts talks about the end times, and it talks about fire from the sky, talks about the sun burning the flesh of man, talks about fish boiling in the sea, talks about plants turning brown. So the number 1 most dangerous aspect of what's happening today is the heat. And I wanted to ask you, if the air temperature at 80 degrees is creating 197 degree dashboard temperature. What's going to happen to that dashboard when the air temperature isn't 80 degrees but is 110 degrees? What's going to happen? And you all need to be asking this question. And we have said for the last 10 years that we would be able to tell when these end times were reaching its pinnacle, when the amount of radiation and heat were pushing Earth over the edge, where crop failures were going to create food shortages that were going to be then aggravated by man, by man's own actions. We have said that you're going to tell when end times is really getting at the end times by the behavior of the billionaires and the control freaks that think this world is theirs. And look around. Look what man has created. We've had a crazy virus that never goes away. We have experimental medicines that were never tested on animals, but yet they want to put them in your children now. I mean, you could tell by the behavior of man. You know, why would you have a right to know what's in your medicine. You have a fundamental First Amendment right to know what you're being injected with, especially a 5-year-old. But yet, nobody's going to tell you everything that's in there. And the law says they don't have to disclose it. And the law says if you're injured, they have no liability. Now, what kind of behavior is that coming from a society that's supposed to prioritize your dignity, your happiness, and your health? And last but not least, the obvious. If there was a brown dwarf coming through the solar system, you would be able to see changes in all the planets. You could not change one planet without changing all planets. Everything would have to change. So if you affect the motion of a single planet, you will affect the motion of all planets. If you affect the motion of a single moon, you would affect the motion of all the moons. If you would change the atmosphere and the appearance of one planet, you would have to change the atmosphere and appearance of all the planets. And there is nothing more obvious than what you see with your naked eye. And we've seen these changes in all the planets. With just the naked eye. And these changes indicate more electrons, more radiation, and more heat. All the planets are changing. And the one that you thought would be most resistant to change, the biggest, baddest, most powerful planet of all, with the strongest magnetosphere, the strongest gravitational forces, would be resistant to change. Jupiter has gone through so many changes. And remember how consistent Jupiter used to be. Jupiter used to be very consistent. And now with your naked eye, you can see the changes. And as of today, the great red spot has shrunk in diameter and slowed, but yet the altitude, the overall height of that big red spot is growing. Why? Because of external pressure. All the planets, to the naked eye, have changed. To the naked eye. So if seeing is believing, and you can't believe, you're in denial. And you are embarking on behaviors that are described in literature as being psychotic or a personality disorder. That is, inability to change your thinking when presented with facts. I don't think it's psychotic. I don't think it's personality disorder, but yet that description exists in the medical literature. I think it's just plain old-fashioned denial, cognitive dissonance. It's unthinkable, it's unbearable, therefore you're going to deny what you see with your naked eye. But if you are involved in that, if you are in denial, if you can't handle the truth, you will be one of the casualties. You will be a statistic. And even those that are aware and are preparing may still be a statistic. Look at me. I may become a statistic in a matter of a year or two. So, be prepared and try really hard not to be scared, because fear controls us. We don't control fear. Let fear motivate you into action. Let fear motivate you into action, not reaction. And until next time, thank you for listening.